I'm about to show you why the biggest film hoax in history wasn't actually a hoax at all, but an authentic look at a real female Sasquatch. My name's Robert, and I've been obsessing over everything to do with Sasquatch research for years now, but even more so since having my own encounter. So at this point, my research includes probably thousands of hours of delving into all things Bigfoot, including, of course, the Patterson-Gimlin film. Why so much effort? Well, simply because I've got this burning and unquenchable desire to learn and share the truth about the beings we call Sasquatch. And that's why I made this video and many others, and that's why you're here now. So before I get into the irrefutable points supporting the film's authenticity, let's just talk about a few of the circumstances surrounding the film. It was shot on October 20th, 1967, at approximately 1 o'clock p.m. by two men, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. They were traveling through Bluff Creek in Northern California. Along this sandbar, they were on horseback, and between them they had a third pack horse, because they were there for about a week, or were planning to be. They were following up on some rumored Bigfoot evidence, mainly large humanoid footprints, and Patterson had this passion project in the works. He wanted to produce a documentary about Sasquatch and hopefully capture some visuals of this evidence, this set of footprints and whatever else they could find. However, according to both men, not surprisingly, they weren't expecting to capture a real live Sasquatch on film. Roger Patterson had rented this camera that he was using. It was a 16mm Kodak Cine 100 movie camera, and it shot at 18 frames per second. And what we ended up with is roughly 59.5 seconds of usable footage. So they were riding along in this remote part of the forest of Bluff Creek, and they rounded a bend, and that's when they saw this large, hairy creature standing upright about 120 feet away, give or take. According to Gimlin, Patterson's horse reared up and threw him off, or partially threw him off, at which point Patterson scrambled for his camera and started filming as the creature walked away from them. The creature looked over its right shoulder, as you've no doubt seen in the film many times, and this is the iconic moment at frame 352 of the film that has become quintessentially Bigfoot. As Patterson scrambled and tried to film and changed positions several times to get a better view, Gimlin dismounted and he had his rifle ready, trained on the creature, but he didn't shoot it. He was just covering Patterson in case the creature decided to charge them or something. The creature walked off, disappeared into the bush. They tried to follow it, but it was fast and they were scared. They were worried other creatures might appear, and eventually they lost the trail. However, because of the soft, silty sediment in the area, this whitish, chalky sediment on the ground, they were later able to find and cast some very compelling footprint evidence, very detailed 15-inch long footprints over 40 inches apart on average. And we'll talk more about those later. But those are the basic circumstances surrounding the film, why the two men were there, what they were doing, and how the film was shot. As you're no doubt aware, or you wouldn't be watching this video, since the film was shot nearly 60 years ago at the time of this video, it's been the subject of this widespread debate, and quite a bizarrely emotional debate, to be honest, on both sides. Both believers and skeptics are guilty of this strong emotion and basing their conclusions not on facts, but mostly on feelings. That said, there are more than enough facts to make an airtight case for the film's authenticity, so let's get into those points now. Let me start by saying right off the bat that the 3 points I'm going to share with you here are not my own ideas. These come from a guy named Bill Munns. He's a veteran Hollywood effects artist, creature designer, and costume maker who's worked in the industry for many years. He's worked on some big-name films, and he knows what he's talking about. He's also not just a costume and creature designer who knows the current version of his trade. He's a bit of a history buff when it comes to creature and costume design, as his excellent book, When Roger Met Patty, details. He knows all the history of the way things used to be done in the costume and creature design industry versus how they're done now, and it's a really interesting read. I'd highly recommend it if you want to go into more detail about this. Point number 1 is the head shape and size discrepancy. Muns explains that when it comes to gorilla suits, and specifically the head part, the mask that fits over the wearer's head, the shape of human heads versus real-life gorilla heads creates this problem. See, real-life gorilla heads have this heavy, overshadowing brow ridge, and then they immediately slope diagonally backwards. And if it's a male gorilla, they will then eventually turn vertical again towards the sagittal crest, that bony ridge on the top of the head. The trouble is, human heads don't do this. After our brows, our foreheads go more or less straight up. I mean, there's some upward, backward slope there, depending on the shape of your head. There is some variation, but for the most part, the human head and cranium goes straight up from the brow. And because of this, Munns explains and shows how a human head would not fit in a scaled gorilla mask if the gorilla's body were the exact size of the human body of the mask wearer. You can see in this diagram of Bill himself working on a gorilla head design, which looks super realistic, by the way, obviously a very talented man. He's superimposed this drawing of his head shape over the gorilla mask, and you can see that his rather normal shaped head would protrude in the forehead area because gorillas just don't have prominent foreheads like humans do. Their craniums are a lot smaller proportionally than ours. So what costume designers have always had to do, he explains, is make gorilla masks that cover the whole head of the wearer proportionally larger compared to the wearer's body than a real gorilla head would be. This is simply a physical necessity. Munns explains that there's no way around it because of the difference in head shape between a human and a gorilla. Every single gorilla mask ever made for any movie has had this problem, and they've all had to solve it the same way, by making the gorilla mask proportionally bigger than a real gorilla's head would be. And this is one very good reason why the Patterson-Gimlin film is so irrefutably authentic. When you look at a side view of Patty's head in a still frame from the Patterson film, you see that proportionally it's a lot smaller than the side view of masks from many well-known Hollywood films involving gorilla suits. The side-by-side comparisons make it super obvious. If Patty were just a guy wearing a suit, the head would simply have to be bigger than what we're seeing here. See, the shape of Patty's head is very similar to the shape of a gorilla's head in profile. We have this sloped back forehead, this almost non-existent forehead really, directly above the brow ridge. But again, if there were a human head stuffed into there, the forehead part would simply need more space than what it's got. As with many Hollywood gorilla suits, the head shape would have to be different to encompass that vertical rise of a human forehead underneath the mask. Either that, or if the head shape were the same as what we see here, the entire head would have to be proportionally larger, again, because there's just not enough room for a human-shaped head if the human body is the size of the body we see in the Patterson-Gimlin film. Point number 2 has to do with the neck. Munns says, quote, "In 1967, the back of the neck on a fur costume was a pain in the ass. There was no great solution for the problems it caused, except to ask whomever is directing and staging the mime to not show the back of the costume and the back of the neck, if it could be avoided. If we had to show the back of the neck, the best plan would be for the mime to stand still. The makeup artist brushed out all the fur to be as smooth as possible, and then film without letting the performer move around, and especially not turn the head." So why was this necessary? Well, basically because the costume material used for fur suits in movies back then had no stretch to it. So there were always these awkward folds of material happening if the person in the suit moved their head any noticeable amount. Like Bill said, makeup artists would try to disguise this fact by brushing long bits of fake fur over the folds in the back of the neck, but it was never very successful if they moved their head. He gives a pretty telling example in these images from the film King Kong Lives, which was made in 1986, which had this problem in a major way because you can see a whole lot of instances of the back of the suit's neck being visible, either directly from the back or as a side view. He says, quote, "There are hairs flaring outward, gaps in the neck, odd lumps and creases, all examples of the problems of a neck on a costume. Patty has none of these. And it's true. When you watch the film slowly, paying particular attention to the neck, which clearly has some movement in it at certain points as she turns her body and head, you don't see these awkward lumps and folds of material appearing. You don't see a hint of them. And according to Munns, you certainly would have if this was a suit, even the best suit possible from the 1960s. Bill summarizes this point in When Roger Met Patty by saying, quote, "How does the Patterson-Gimlin film subject figure we call Patty manage to have a flawless neck before the look back, an unwrinkled neck during the head turn, and a flawless neck after the look back when she resumes looking forward and we see her perfectly from the back? She manages to do something that neither the 1976 King Kong or the sequel 1986 King Kong Lives could accomplish, despite both movies having a good number of talented Hollywood professionals and studio backing to produce excellence. Bottom line, her neck would not look nearly so realistic if this were a suit. It's impossible." The third reason Patty can't possibly be a costume from the 1960s has to do with the shoulder and armpit. Munns explains in When Roger Met Patty that costume designers have always had serious difficulties when it comes to joining the arm portion of a monkey suit to the chest portion in a way that looks and moves realistically. He says, quote, "One option is to force brush the fur along the sides of this seam toward the arm opening, so the hair on both sides of the seams runs parallel and shingles over the arm section of the costume. Delicate spots of glue on some of the hair fibers from each side of the seam will help keep the hair laying as brushed as one technique. The result of this is a torso costume section where the chest skin, the prosthetic, fades into the chest fur and arm several inches inward of the actual armpit and arm sleeve. The armpit is solid fur, and the cut of the arm sleeve joining the torso vest is a tailoring seam that goes vertical across the armpit line, dividing chest and arm. But we don't see that in the Patterson-Gimlin film. The standard costume technique is clearly not being employed." And he's right. When you look at this image showing the pectoral muscle insertion on a human where it meets the upper arm, we see this fold or flap of muscle, the edge of the pectoral muscle as it thins out towards that insertion point. This isn't something that was possible to recreate on a monkey suit from the 1960s, again because of the lack of stretch of the material that was available. Spandex did exist in 1967. It was invented in 1959, and at that time it had just begun to enter the entertainment industry in an embryonic way, but it certainly wasn't used for most Hollywood costume designs and absolutely wouldn't have been available to two amateur pranksters. And that's why even the best gorilla suit makers of the 60s had to do all this fancy footwork with brushing the hair in certain directions and gluing it down, basically trying to hide the fact that there was this unnatural, non-stretching area of material joining the arm to the upper chest. Whereas real bipedal hominids have this pectoral muscle insertion thing going on. And guess what? Patty has that. You can clearly see in this frame that as she turns and looks at the camera, you have that visible pectoral inserting into the upper arm, a detail that, again, was completely impossible with 1960s costume tech. That's why Bill explains, quote, "What we see in the Patterson-Gimlin film differs from standard costume design in two respects. First, the chest section doesn't have a conspicuous fur perimeter, as just about any ape suit you'll ever see does. And second, the armpit has a curious flowing contour from chest to arm like a real anatomical arm does, and fur costumes never normally do." And he's talking about even today. Even with stretchy fabrics, this is not an easy thing to replicate, at least not in a way that moves naturally. Addressing skeptical arguments. So we've covered 3 ironclad points from a costume design perspective as to why the Patterson-Gimlin film couldn't possibly have been a costume, certainly not from the 1960s, from a man who definitely knows what he's talking about. But of course, there are still many commonly discussed skeptical arguments. I see them all the time in the comments section of previous Patterson-Gimlin film videos that I've made. So let's quickly go through these. First of all, no, neither Patterson nor Gimlin admitted to the film being a fake, ever. This is a super common one, and it always bothers me because people will make the claim all the time that Patterson, who sadly died in 1972, just 5 years after the film was captured, from lymphoma, that he made some sort of a deathbed confession that the film was in fact a hoax, that it was just a guy in a suit. There's no evidence whatsoever that he made any admission of the sort, and I'm always questioning when people make this claim. Like, how do you know? You didn't know Patterson personally. Are you trying to tell me that you were in the room where he passed away, by his bedside, comforting his grieving wife, and you heard him make this whispered confession? Seems like a bit of a stretch. And by the way, the other gentleman, Bob Gimlin, also has remained rock solid in his assertion that the film is authentic. He's still alive. He's in his 90s now, and he has had a whole lot of pressure over the decades, and ridicule launched his way to try to get him to recant and admit that it was a hoax, but he's never budged 1 inch, despite being offered $1 million to recant and having his name regularly dragged through the mud. He's absolutely certain about what he saw.
Well, think whatever you want to think. I know what I saw, and if you've seen the film footage, analyze it and think about it. And don't tell me that they can't exist, and because there's so many people out in the woods all the time that would see one. I'd say, don't even talk to me about that. I said, just think about what you're saying, and if you don't, then that's your ball game.
Next point. Yes, a guy named Bob Hieronymus did say that it was a costume and that he was the man in the costume. Trouble is, he changed his story multiple times. He was very inconsistent on the details. Details like what the suit was made of, how he got it, who made it, where it is now, what became of it after the filming. He just couldn't stick to any consistent story. He also failed to replicate Patty's walk convincingly, despite attempting to do so. At first glance, his walk versus Patty's walk might seem similar to the untrained eye, but you can clearly see that there are massive differences in stride length and in thigh angle as he steps versus Patty stepping. Next point. Yes, a costume designer named Philip Morris said that he made and sold the suit to Roger Patterson, but Philip Morris attempted a recreation of what he was claiming was his own work decades later, so if anything, he should have been more experienced and skilled by then, and the results were shockingly bad. In fact, his recreation attempt is so dissimilar to Patty that when I first saw it, I honestly wondered, is this satire? Is the man just trying to pull a joke or something? By the way, the gentleman in this recreated suit is Bob Hieronymus. Another objection I always hear is that people think they can see boots or the bottom of shoe soles as Patty steps. No, you cannot see boots. In fact, when you zoom in on this restored and sharpened frame from the film, you can clearly see toes. Yes, they're whitish, but as I've already explained, the riverbed in that area was filled with this chalky white sediment. It's picking up on the bottom of her feet. Bare feet get sticky. No, you cannot see a wallet in the pocket of whoever is wearing the suit. This bizarre claim is one that I've heard more often than you might think, and I always wonder when I hear it, do people really think that if Patterson and Gimlin went to all this trouble to pull off the hoax of the century, that the guy they hire to wear the suit is going to forget his big, fat, noticeable wallet in his pocket? It's ludicrous. I think what they're actually seeing is this horizontal line on the upper portion of Patty's right thigh, which to me looks a lot more like the fur being rubbed away by the swinging motion of her hand and fingers over that spot on her thigh than the bulging of a wallet full of credit cards and cash. And no, you cannot see a zipper. If you look at this sharpened frame clearly showing Patty's back, there's no evidence of a zipper in sight. Artifacting from much lower quality versions of the film, like nearly every one floating around the internet, might trick you into thinking you're seeing a zipper, But this enhanced frame, which was not done with AI or Photoshop, but simple sharpening and development techniques, reveals detail that was originally captured but not visible with the film development techniques at the time. Now it is visible, and you can clearly see the conspicuous lack of zipper. And yes, of course, it is a coincidence that Patterson and Gimlin were in the area filming a documentary about Bigfoot and happened to catch a Bigfoot on camera. But when you think about it logically, it's not that far-fetched. Basically, we're talking about two men who were following up on evidence, who came prepared with equipment and ready to spend a long time in this area documenting this evidence, who found what they were looking for. Well-prepared people find what they're looking for all the time in life. Before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about enhanced versions of the film. I've already shown you a few enhanced frames from the film. So what do I mean by enhanced exactly? Well, first of all, I'm not talking about adding details that weren't originally there. Film development techniques in the 1960s and 70s were not nearly as advanced as they are today, and that's why we have many stabilized and clarified versions of the film floating around the internet, albeit ones that are still fairly blurry when you zoom in. Now, I happen to know that a professional photo archivist by the name of Todd Gatewood is currently working on a much better restored version of the film, even than the stabilized and clarified versions I've shown here, a version that's going to show incredible and unprecedented detail, but we'll have to wait a little bit longer for that. The enhanced frames I've shown you here are actually given to me courtesy of Todd Gatewood to use in my videos to demonstrate how silly many of the skeptical theories are. But even the highly flawed, stabilized and clarified versions we see on YouTube currently show a whole lot more detail than Roger Patterson's original. When you look at the original, you can see how incredibly shaky it is, which coincidentally is another point in favor of authenticity. If Patterson somehow managed to have this incredible suit created that broke the mold of costume design from that era in an unprecedented fashion, and that solved every physical problem that costume designers of the era had, why on earth wouldn't he have gotten closer and held the camera a little steadier? Was he pretending to be startled and faking the need to run around to different locations, shaking the camera the whole time to try to get a better vantage point? Because if so, he did a pretty convincing job. If this whole thing was an orchestrated hoax, he really wasted the opportunity if this is all he got. But I digress a bit, so back to enhancement. The fact is, it's extremely possible to wildly improve vintage footage from the 1960s shot on a 16mm Kodachrome camera. We see it all the time. Restored versions of vintage footage that are clearer, crisper, and even appear to have more resolution than the original. This isn't AI or digital trickery. This is simply very intelligent and careful frame-by-frame enhancement of what was originally captured. And that's exactly why the frame-by-frame restoration that Todd Gatewood is working on has yielded these stunning results. Most of the versions of the film floating around YouTube are 4th or 5th generation bootleg copies. Todd was working from the original. Now, all that said, all the logical arguments in the world don't tend to convince hard-nosed skeptics about the film's authenticity. And the reason is that they don't really care about the logic. They don't care that a human head couldn't fit into a gorilla mask the shape and size proportionally of Patty's head. They don't care that the pectoral muscle insertion into the upper arm in the film matches biological reality rather than the clumsy details of 1960s costumes. None of that matters to them because of one simple thing that they usually say: it just looks fake to me. And to that I usually say, fair enough. I'm not here to try to make Patterson-Gimlin film converts. I'm just here to explain to logical and open-minded folks why there's no reasonable basis to think that this is a fake. That said, I do think it's worth noting one particular point that the hard-nosed variety of skeptics often bring up: Patty's butt. I'm always getting comments on my Patterson-Gimlin film examination videos about how Patty's butt looks like a fake padded diaper. And honestly, I can kind of see it. Like, fair enough. But here's the thing, and I'm going to get a little politically incorrect here, so apologies in advance. But have you seen the backside of a heavy-set, aging woman? Gravity does have an effect. There can be a lot of mass there that doesn't just protrude like straight muscle, but tends to sag down towards the bottom as fat usually does. Who says that every single Sasquatch, regardless of age or gender, has to be this ripped bodybuilder? Speaking of Patty's physical assets, it's also worth noting that obviously she is a she, possessing breasts. I don't know about you, but my very clear impression of the 1960s is that many industries were male-dominated down to the finest detail, and that included costume design. I don't think your average costume maker in the 60s would put breasts on his project. It would have been seen as weird, as inappropriate. And yet, there they are, two very prominent mammary glands. More points in favor of authenticity. So now I'd like to briefly summarize a few of the more common points supporting the film's authenticity, which, when combined with what I've already discussed, make an absolutely airtight case. This thing couldn't have been fake. There's not a chance. I've already shared a lot of these details in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into insane depth on these, but just touch on each of them. First of all, we've got muscle movement on Patty, specifically the right thigh and calf muscles. There are other bits of muscle visible too, but you can clearly see this shock wave travel up her right thigh muscle as she takes a step, as her immense weight is distributed onto that right leg. This would be an incredibly difficult thing to replicate in a costume with today's technology, and in 1967, utterly impossible. The calf muscle too, it's visibly flexing as she pushes her weight off of that foot, just the way a human calf muscle would. It's hard to even imagine what would be required in some sort of suit or costume apparatus to recreate this convincingly. We've also got a clearly visible mid-tarsal break in Patty's foot. The mid-tarsal break is the great ape equivalent to the arch in human feet. Our arches support us and act as shock absorbers as we walk around, and for great apes who have to deal with difficult terrain, bumps and rocks and roots, the mid-tarsal break affords them a whole lot of adaptability and adjustment to the terrain they have to traverse. Primatologists and locomotion experts agree that when it comes to walking over difficult terrain regularly, the mid-tarsal break is a much better biological piece of equipment than our arches would be. And it's worth noting that you can not only see the mid-tarsal break on Patty's foot, but it's also clearly visible in the many very convincing and detailed track casts that were recovered from the site afterwards. And once again, these tracks averaged about 15 inches long each, with a stride length of about 41 inches on average, way beyond the average size and stride length for a human, even a taller than average human. Another point worth mentioning is just how many highly qualified experts in fields related to the Patterson-Gimlin film have come out with statements in favor of its authenticity. Fields like primatology, anthropology, locomotion and biomechanics, biology, zoology, you name it. And yes, there are some experts on the other side of the fence too, who say that they feel it's fake. But if you look at their reasons for thinking that, most of the time they boil down to, it just looks fake to me. Whereas most of the reasons given by experts who say it's authentic actually have substance to them. The Patterson-Gimlin film is one of those things where the more closely you examine it and delve into all the nitty-gritty details, the more fascinating and indisputably authentic it becomes. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to Cabin in the Woods. Support me further using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below, or for a few dollars a month by becoming a channel member, or buying some of my Cabin in the Woods exclusive merchandise, t-shirts and hoodies and mugs, that sort of thing. And let me know if you feel I'm succeeding at giving Bigfoot believers reasonable logical grounds to defend their belief, or if you're a Bigfoot knower, to explain why this is a reality to your skeptical friends and family. I hope I'm succeeding at that, because that's really what I'm after here. There's my dog barking in the background. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.